Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for January of 2025. There were only 6 new albums that dropped over the last month that I decided to dive into, but there were still some anticipated things that were still cropping up even this early on in the year, and generally just some interesting intrigue finally peaked a little farther. As always, there are time codes. Listen to the description if you do want to jump around in this video, but yeah. 10 years of listening log updates, and I'm excited to keep pillaging forth on this pilgrimage of new tunes that I sit through. Give it a like if you are also excited, and let's go ahead and dive on in by starting with...
Off the bridge to his wedding song, blew out the bass in the speakers, you can still hear the trouble going.
The album once thought lost to time, Mac Miller's Balloonerism, was given an official release by his estate this past month. With it came some interesting, but like not necessarily personally interesting, I guess, side things like a short film linked to the album. I care less about that, but I do care a lot about the vision behind what is an interesting record in hindsight, because Balloonerism is an album that was like constructed, or at least like initially constructed, while he was doing stuff like Faces. Like, he was doing this, like, very abstract style very well, in my opinion. I like this era of Mac's music. It's some of my personal favorite releases in his catalog. But I honestly hadn't had any knowledge of this album until after he'd even passed anyway, when, like, a track listing of this was leaked, because for as much as I love Mac Miller, admittedly, some of his more out there and tangential stuff is stuff that I don't revisit quite as often. But Balloonerism is a release that, oddly enough, feels still as timely as ever with some of the subject matter, but also sonically really kind of matches a lot of those pockets of his career that were always left in the shadows to some degree, and gives them a stage that I think they hold and enhance some of the messages and sentiments on this record. You know, a real back and forth on his relationship with drugs that I think, again, feels all too poetic in hindsight, but like is wild to see him even gripping with personally, like at this point in his career, when thinking about like when these songs had started to be made. You know, it's also like oddly prolific considering the touches of SZA that are like all over this thing. You know, she's posted a lot about like her early career and working with Mac, and it's interesting to see some of that come to life throughout this, and I think make for some of the highlights on here. You know, I think that like DJ's Chord Organ, which is this just really cool sounding jam, you know, like it's got the same instrument used on like LP's Stepfather Factory, but like its use here fits the airy atmosphere that, like, the album's title and imagery of Balloonerism really sort of evoke, and, like, SZA's vocals help suit that atmosphere. They've got this rawness to them, too, that I think is just, again, evocative of some of the identity that this album has surrounding it. You know, his like darker alter ego Delusional Thomas has like a piece of an interlude on here. Like, there's a lot of components of this that lend to this more raw side of the emotional, you know, journey that Mac had been going through, and I think that it creates an interesting, you know, listen. It's not necessarily my favorite Mac Miller record, even in this iteration of it, but I do love what is going on here nonetheless. You know, I think that, like, the way that it starts in this bright, airy atmosphere that definitely feels, like, psychedelic and jazzy, you know, while it has its, you know, still hook-leaning, or at least, like, really infectious, you know, to some degree, songwriting-wise, moments like $5 Pony Rides. It wastes no time in going more off the deep end throughout moments like Miss Deborah Downer into Stoned. You know, I think that, like, while bar spinning is very deep, unfriendly hallucinations, there's just a backbeat to it that, like, helps carry the listener through it in a way that's not quite as dark or as down as the album goes to. I mean, tracks like Funny Papers really seem wild in hindsight, especially considering how reflective they are, and the sort of POV that section of the record really leans into, while adding to the airy atmosphere. It honestly feels kind of wild in hindsight, and I can understand why his estate would work so hard with the creative minds he was working with to help bring this vision to light, especially considering how it sort of frames Mac Miller in the vision of his fame throughout some of the tracks on here. It feels like an album that I could see where people are coming from with hesitation for it, considering it is a posthumous release and one that was a technically unfinished album. But, and not to throw it into the realms of video games, this feels like the Star Fox 2 of Mac Miller's career. It's an album that he cared for so much during an era where he was doing a lot of interesting things, album and mixtape wise. But, I understand why he never fully finished it. He was always busy doing something else. It always felt like a finished entity as it was, especially considering some of the leaked track listings. This is very much late in the creative process release. But, I get the vision. I get what they're doing, and I think it fits. And I think it sounds really good and sounds like the artist in question. And I think it's alright, but I understand hesitation with it in general. I've thought about where I'm gonna rate this, and I'm probably I'm sitting with it at an 8. It's definitely amongst the higher moments in his discography, but I wouldn't put it at the very top. But it's very much one of those well constructed experiences that, even if done and released and finished posthumously, still felt like there was a framework around it that had his touch to it. And I really like that about it. When looking at what was coming out in January, I was gobsmacked that I was going to be able to listen to another new Franz Ferdinand album upon release without it potentially getting buried by something else, because I've always appreciated how consistent this band was. Sure, there were some odd plateaus in their career, but I thought that their last album, Always Ascending, was an upswing in their catalog. I will say that makes this new album, The Human Fear, all the more unfortunate, at least a little bit, because while it isn't bad, I think that it is a very solid album from this group. There isn't a real album feeling experience across this runtime, and it feels like this very much just kind of oddly cobbled together batch of songs. Sure, there's a sort of theme or through line in some of the ideas of fear that are tackled in the lyrics and some of the soundscape. I don't think it all feels well pulled together. I understand the framework the album sort of leads with, but it doesn't sort of carry the listener through anything all that super interesting or engaging. There's some solid jams woven throughout The Human Fear, but I think that comparatively to, especially the last album that they released, this is a slight step down in my opinion. And that's not to say that the album leads with a bad foot. Audacious is admittedly one of the better songs. When the album was coasting into the proverbial rear view, it's one of those songs that I did immediately kind of want to respin, because it is an awkward start to the album, but it's got a decent hook, and I think that that pocket of the record has an interesting sort of sequencing, even if it isn't necessarily the most sensible. The Doctor is a nice synth-led jam, even if hooked after it has a sort of herky-jerky groove. I think it's sort of it fits, it's evocative of sort of the energy the album has cooking. It's just an awkward-feeling album. And while the band really tries to do something with that, I just don't think it really left me loving spinning this in full every time I sat down with it. Not that the songs were bad, they just didn't necessarily keep me wanting to come back for more. Yeah, I love the arrangement on Night or Day, and I think that is another really strong highlight, along with how dramatic it gets after that with the following tracks of Tell Me I Should Stay and Cats. There's a real back and forth emotionally, and that's a nice little nugget of this album, but I don't think it necessarily pushes forth after that into the horizons with anything that is worth the awkward journey there. It reminds me of some of the other meddling moments in their career that left me lukewarm and not as excited for revisiting the album in question. I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. It isn't by any means the worst rock album I've spun, and it's certainly not maybe the worst in their career, but I could see it landing amongst that crop, to say the least. Listen, I really enjoyed Louie Zong's form of funk fusions and world building on Rat Taxi, and to see him be this sort of like pocket project world builder funk musician, I was definitely in for hearing him do some bass amateur shop vibes. You know, that sort of like fishy funk. You guys know I'm very much a fan of that. And I think that his twists on it on this create some really fun moments that, similarly to Rat Taxi, just take me to a fun little world for a while. I just also wish that there was more of this world to sit around in. You know, that Fisherman's Hymn is one of the highlights that really sits at a perfect length, but like, dude, I love the bass tapping on By the Lake. It evokes that very much like fisherman style energy that, again, I feel like Les Claypool definitely taps into, but like he does his own thing with it. I did what Louie Zong does here. You know, the synth funk stuff on like Catch of the Day is fun as hell. The same for the almost like funk hip hop atmosphere that's channeled on Big Mouth Billy. There's just some really fun, funky ideas that I enjoy what Louie Zong's doing on here. But like Longer on the Line's another one, man. That just funky synth groove, that clav groove is just iconic. I love the sounds of it. Really fun project. If you just want some fun, fishy funk to start your year off, this has got some fun stuff there. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10. It's solid as hell. And it's just a nice little pocket project that I'm definitely think that, like, if you want some good, funky energy in, like, the springtime, give this a spin once the green starts coming out. Because I think you'll enjoy what you're chilling with. Now, I've been waiting with bated breath for Ethel Cain's follow-up to Preacher's Daughter. I thought that album was a nice sort of rug pull sonically that I think has an intense but well-executed payoff. And I like that Perverts, her newest release, is a doubling down on some of those darker ideas and creates an unsettling lo-fi album that I think suits the colder months and, you know, sort of feels like diving back into some of the very intense dark places that Preacher's Daughter went, but gets like depressing with it in some really real feeling ways due to the atmosphere sort of channeled on here. You know, it has its moments of that sort of like bright beauty that shine in the early parts of Preacher's Daughter, like on the choral stuff on Punish, or on some of the melody play on like Amber Waves, and some of the sort of shining moments in the Misery on a track like Etienne, before it just gets burrowed back in the darkness on Thorautia. I think that like the album does this really nice ebb and flow in some of that energy, even if it is a lot more ambiently driven. I enjoy the moments of cyclical sort of instrumentation as well, like on a Vacillator and on Pull Drone especially. Some of the drones on there are just so well done. That cyclical sort of vocal style on House of Psychotic Woman has this sort of numb feeling to the vocal delivery by the end that I think is, it lends to that and adapts that use and inspiration of repetitive song structure. You know, while very minimal in approach, I like the room at which production-wise a lot of that minimalism sits in. It's one of those type of artful but like very well constructed experimental releases that always gets like some accolades across the board, and I think is definitely worth it in my opinion. If you like that sort of very haunting atmosphere that has like moments of optimism shining through, but they don't really linger as much as some of the darker ideas woven throughout this record's crevices. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Really strong release that I think really pivots her career in an interesting direction, but I'm not upset about it. The month ended with 2 releases that I was very excited for very different reasons. And one of them being because I'm a pretty big fan of The Weeknd's discography, and I was very curious to see where he was going to send his career off to. And on Hurry Up Tomorrow, I think he has a still bold, but interesting in how bold, and bold in what ways, Abel takes his sort of sonic direction with this character, with this version of himself into the sunset. And I honestly really also like that he takes the full circle approach with how the album's last song loops to the beginning of House of Balloons. But like, yeah, Hurry Up Tomorrow is a really cool, more leaning into the thematic driven stuff on Dawn FM and After Hours, but into this finality that feels like a bender to end all benders globally into the horizon. This record feels very, like, truthful, but also gets lost in that truth to some degree. Unlike the other parts of this trilogy, this record's length feels most present, and it's partially because of the sonic directions and pivots he takes the listener through on here lead to interesting stretches before these stretches of songs that, like, while still very big and catchy and infectious to some degree, in some instances have some of the more lulls within this track listing. I do think that the album does honestly lean into its cinematic feel in some choice ways that keep me at least hooked for a decent stretch of the record. Like, I enjoy the Justice collab that opens this record up, and I love that this record honestly uses all of its features to lend to that feel in that same breath. Like, I think the electronic-leaning ones, like your Justices or your Giorgio or Mordares, lend to their respective stretches. And I also think that, like, those collabs play into some of the other pivots the album sort of carries through that initial stretch. Like, Sao Paulo, I think, really amps the listener up after some cinematic highs, and I think culminates to a really good stretch that leans more into where this trilogy has sort of, like, really thrived in its inspirations, but then has some fun fusions not too long later with the Florence and the Machine and Travis Scott collab that I think leads well into the Future collab. And honestly, I think Future's collab is a bit better than Travis's, but I think Travis does a good job at sort of morphing the atmosphere that that song was more leaning into, and lends to a good pivot into what I would say is maybe my least favorite stretch of the record. It's not necessarily the least compelling, because tracks like Given Up on Me at least have like an interesting switch up in their second half to sort of bring the listener to this more mellow portion. But I think that, like, I Can't Wait to Get There and the Cardi track aren't necessarily my favorite slices to sort of sit with during this more mellow portion of the record. The album gets a little bit better from there, but again, Niagara Falls isn't my favorite amongst this record's more throwback sounding songs. Like, I think that Take Me Back to LA after that has this, like, synth pop forward, very 80s inspired sound that I think sort of helps add to some expansions from where he's taken this trilogy. Like, there's some interesting, fun, full circle moments on a grand scale happening on here. I just think it lends to a record that, while having all of these highs, and for how long this record sits with the listener, admittedly fits this sort of, like, cinematic storytelling. That approach lends to some stretches that I don't think hit as hard as others in his discography. I really respect what he's got going on in this, though. I do think that as far as, like, being a record with a vision, it reminds me the most like a record like Starboy. Like, it's got this flirtation with these different ideas and this cocktail, but I think that it taps into the cinematic approach he's really tried to sort of build into his creative energy over this trilogy and goes the distance with it in a way that I think sticks the landing by the by. Like, could I see some people being turned off with how long this record is? Sure. But I think that, like, if you give this record the time of day, it's a pretty fun listen. It's got some great pop songs. It's got some really good leading atmosphere, even if I don't think it's the most consistently tackled aspect of the sound on here. It's at least got a cool approach that I can enjoy a decent amount. I'd give this like an 8 out of 10. I think that it's a really bold record and a great bold style send-off to a career that I think has been an interesting melding of sort of art and artistry that I think has this great blockbuster finale that I think it deserves. Thanks for the tunes, Abel, under this moniker. I'll probably do a discography review later on this year.
I agree, I remember bad. I be 10 scabs. If I bleed, I'll pay the cracks. Got a bitter rap for the...
I've really got to give Mike's discography a better eye if records like Showbiz are a better showcasing of his brand of sort of world building through abstract ideas. Because while I liked the collaborative edge of Pinball, it didn't quite go the full 9 on what I was wholly expecting considering some of the collabs I've heard him on. But Showbiz absolutely was. I really like where he takes his ideas, and I like how he creates this stage of sorts for him to spin this very grounded and real, but still, like, wild flow style. And I fuck with this heavy. I think the play with the samples on tracks like Then We Could Be Free and Watered Down are in a similar spirit, but still, like, emotionally different. I also enjoy just that sort of use of it on album scale. You know, that spacey atmosphere is more what it's tapped into on What You About to Do, A Star Was Born. But, like, how it carries through the psychedelic de rock into the throwback of The Weight is this sort of mystical portion of the record that I think sounds really fucking sick. You know, I wasn't wholly expecting these, like, whirlwind songs and these, like, tiny little nuggets, but I think it lends to the very off-kilter haziness that Mike very much dances in. You know, it lends to the eeriness on a track like Number 82, which goes into the Too Hot interlude with an interesting sort of hard pivot. If you enjoy really loose ideas and you enjoy hip-hop with a little bit more of an experimental edge, definitely give this a spin. I think that it's got some really cool stage setting, both lyrically and sonically, thematically, and I think showcases, honestly, his vision building better than what I had been introduced to his discography with. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I know I'm giving a lot of 8s this month, but it's a really strong start to the year, and I think that, I don't know how far Mike is going to go with me this year, but I think Showbiz is definitely one of those records that I've enjoyed the world he takes me through, at least how he presents it on Showbiz, a lot. And that's where I spun. Do you agree with my thoughts? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. If you want to see me talk about an album you've spun already that I missed, let me know those in the comments down below. I've got some stuff on my radar for February already that I'm going to be spinning so that I can talk about them with you on here. But either way, I'm going to go. Thank you again so very much for watching. I'm Devour Rack. You guys are good at these lives and situations, and I'll see you another day.